Welcome to Right Medicine, a podcast that explores the minds, motivations, and practices of people who create content that connects with and educates healthcare professionals. I'm your host, Alex Howson, a former nurse, a medical sociologist, and an education writer and researcher in healthcare. Join me to learn from education professionals about resources and tools of the trade, and listen to stories about what drives them in the medical education field. If your work involves planning, designing, or delivering education to healthcare professionals, this podcast is for you. Season 2 of Right Medicine is brought to you by CME Palooza, the bestest and freest online event for the CME community. Plus, you get two incredibly suave gentlemen. Okay, one incredibly suave gentleman. I'll leave it to you to figure out who that is. The fall agenda for CME Palooza is out now. CME Palooza, where the CME community hangs out. Hello and welcome to Right Medicine. I'm your host, Alex Howson. Before this episode starts, I just want to jump in and say I really appreciate your comments, emails, and reviews. And recently, Amanda Steinmeier, who's Senior Director of Educational Strategy at Medical Learning Institute, Inc., left a sweet message. She says, "I have been following your podcast and listened to every episode, so thank you for what you do. And of course, I thoroughly enjoyed this most recent episode with Karen Overstreet." That was episode 13, in case you missed it. You can catch up with my conversation with Karen wherever you listen to podcasts. Anne Jacobson is an independent writer who's also working on a PhD in curriculum instruction and design from the University of South Florida, with a specialist focus on healthcare professional education. Anne chose to specialise in continuing healthcare education, or CME CPD, in the mid-2000s, although she had been working as a medical writer since 1999. We recorded our conversation in May 2021, where we talked about the fact that we've come to know the term long hauler in reference to COVID-19. Anne is a long hauler in continuing healthcare education, which is no mean feat. For Anne and many colleagues in continuing healthcare education, the last 18 months or so has been a time of taking stock and reflecting on what we want the next phases of our careers to look like. We discuss this process of reflection and the path it leads toward questions about how we find fulfillment in work and life. As many guests on Right Medicine have shared, there are so many different stories of how we found our way into medical writing and continuing medical education. Anne observes that across all these different stories is a consistent theme. Most of us didn't follow a pre-existing passion for medical writing or medical education or continuing healthcare education. We discovered it while we were on the road to other things. But what many people share in this space is what Cal Newport calls a craftsman mindset. And that's key to staying in this field in a sustainable, long-term fashion. Join us to hear more. Hello and welcome to Right Medicine. I'm Alex Howson, and I'm here today with Anne Jacobson, who's an independent medical writer working in continuing medical education. Hi, Anne. Hi. Good to have you here today. So we're here to talk about what it takes to stay in continuing medical education as an independent writer, and what are some of the skills and qualities that really help support that journey. But let's start with sharing with listeners who you are and the kind of work that you do.
Okay, great. Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. You've had such an amazing group of guests on the podcast so far, and I'm honored to be among them. So, everyone's story is different, which we'll come back to. But my particular story in getting into medical writing and CME is I was an English major. After graduating from college, thought I might want to go to medical school. And so I went back and I did a post-bac pre-med program, and I did some of the things that you do if you're following an unusual path back to medical school. So I worked in a few research labs and got in some research publications, and I was enjoying that environment, but I was still not quite sure if that was going to be the right path for me. And in doing that, working at a research lab, I met someone else who was working there. She was a disgruntled PhD student at the time who knew that the lab path was not going to be for her, and she had discovered medical writing. And so she was the one who turned me on to it. And it was very much a eureka moment. I didn't know that medical writing was a thing. And it was a great mix of my two interests at that time. So I kind of got onto that. My first gig was covering a medical conference just over 20 years ago, so 1999. So that was back in the internet boom where, there was such an appetite for content. You could get hired to cover a medical conference with a very little experience. So it was great timing. I was hired to cover some medical conferences. And once I had a few clips, I was off to the races as a freelance medical writer. So then I branched into other aspects of medical writing. I worked for some medical communications agencies. And back in those days, a single medical agency would handle the full gamut of projects. So what we now consider both promotional and educational. So we would work with one supporter, one brand team, and we would do both their ad boards and speaker training. And then we turn around and do their satellite symposium, which today we would gasp at the horrors of that, but that's how it was. So, but things were evolving, and as an industry, standards got tighter, and it became clear by about the mid 2000s that you had to choose a side. So you had to, companies were splitting into sister agencies, and you had to choose the promotional path or the accredited medical education path. And I chose CME. So I've been focused pretty much exclusively on medical writing and CME for about the past 15 years, and mostly as an independent consultant.
You're a long hauler.
Yes, for sure.
So there's a couple of things there I want to pick up on. One is for other writers who are listening to this episode and who may be kind of relatively early in their career. Can you talk a little bit about how you found those initial few clients? I actually remember seeing a slide deck that you must have shared at an AMWA conference, an American Medical Writers Association conference at some point, and thinking, oh, wow, I'd really like to do that kind of work, but really having no idea how to. I think it was on meeting support.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm so grateful to what I did is I found my way onto the National Association of Science Writers. I became a member there, and members there that wasn't even a listserv. It was just message boards. And people were so generous in sharing their own experiences and truly just the mechanics of freelance writing and conference coverage. Because it was science writers, they tended to focus on life science conferences. But even, how to find clients, how to invoice, how to register for a conference as press, things like that. So I really just absorbed all that information and took that as an instruction manual to do it myself. And again, the timing was just so great. I think had it been a different time, I would have met with less rapid success, but you really could. I was living in Atlanta at the time. It was a big conference town. I just looked up all the conferences that were coming and wasn't shy about sending out emails to any related journal that had an online presence and said, hey, hire me. I'll go cover this conference for you. No travel expenses. And then built it from there.
So you really had a go get them approach to this work from the start. Where did that come from?
I did. I don't know. Part of it is that I could do it somewhat anonymously. And what I mean by that is I wasn't picking up the phone and cold calling people because that's terrifying, but I could do it in an email and I could communicate with my client and discuss all the work and do all that by email, which was much less terrifying. And I guess just really an appetite for it just really seemed like such a good fit for me. It was so exciting. It was such a find after years of trying to find my place. I thought, wow, this is something really interesting.
And I'm curious too, then, what was it about the education side that particularly drew you and made you want to kind of pick that side?
Yeah, well, it's funny because there are aspects to both sides that are nice. And, writing is writing. But I'll admit to you that it was more that I was deterred from promotional, because that was back in the day when we were still, everything, of course, on promotional needs to go through medical legal review, and still that's done electronically. But back in that time, everything was printed out in binders. So to print hard copies of everything, hard copies of every reference, highlight things by hand. And if you wanted to change, if you wanted to say the sky is blue, you needed a reference and a highlighted reference in the binder, page X in the binder. And if you wanted to change anything at any point, you had to redo the binder madness. And so it was more like, I don't want to deal with the medical legal review aspects of promotional. Surely there's just as robust quality standards on the educational side, from a scientific accuracy point of view and all of that. But the mechanics of it were different and less horrifying. So that was really what led me down the education path. Mm-hmm.
And so what is it like to be a long hauler in medical writing and continuing medical education in particular?
Yeah, I'm so glad that we chose this topic today. I really thought this was an interesting topic because, you've had so many great discussions with your guests on many of the details of content development in CME. So things like activity formats and instructional design and learner engagement and how to do these things, all of those topics are near and dear to my heart. But I was thinking for today, since we share some of that long hauler writing theme in both of our professional careers, I thought it'd be really interesting to pull back from that and take a look at the bigger picture of medical writing as a long-term career. And also, I know for a lot of us, so we're recording in May 2021, so we're starting to see the light at the end of the pandemic tunnel. But for a lot of us, this period has really been a time of reflection and taking stock of all aspects of our lives, but definitely professionally. Are we happy, and what are we doing, and what are the next phases of our careers going to look like? And so I thought it would be interesting to talk about that, both for people who are in the earlier stages of their careers, thinking about if this might be a good track for them. And then also for those of us who are like ourselves, a little more experienced, and just being sort of reflective on it. So, I'm a person who likes to do her homework. So in preparing our conversation, I was really thinking through a lot of these issues and how to approach them. And I kept returning to the work of Cal Newport, who is a professor of computer science at Georgetown and writes a lot of books for the layperson. Mm-hmm. And I'm really a fan of his work. So he concentrates, so for those who aren't familiar with him, his academic research focuses on how digital technology interacts with our personal and professional lives. He got a lot of attention for a book called Deep Work that looked at knowledge workers. So those of us who do cognitively demanding work, how we can balance our need to concentrate on our demanding tasks, but do so in work environments that are increasingly becoming more challenging to concentrate in, given all the digital distractions we have. And in another book, he offered solutions for that called Digital Minimalism, where he really advocates for stepping away to allow that deep work. But anyway, that's some more of his recent work. But in one of his earlier books, it sets a perfect framework for our discussion and my thoughts around having a long-term, meaningful career in this field. So in that book, which is called So Good They Can't Ignore You, he explores and challenges the directive that we hear a lot about setting up our work lives of follow your passion. That's going to that you're going to find fulfillment in work and ultimately life if you follow your passion. But so how does that apply to us? So as we already talked about at the beginning, and most guests share, we all come to medical writing and CME through so many different paths to the point where it's almost a joke or a fun icebreaker at any CME event, because it's, well, how did you find your way here? Because I know it wasn't on purpose. So what crazy path did you take to get here? So by definition, none of us has followed our pre-existing passion for this. We found it on accident. So does that mean that we missed the boat of following our passion? Are we doomed to live the perpetual heartache of not having followed our passion. And what I love about Newport's work is he argues, luckily, no, absolutely not. It's not too late for us. And in fact, he kind of says that he argues that instead of that passion model of figuring out what your passion is and building your work around that, he flips it and he argues that ultimately we're going to find greater fulfillment in our work lives over the long haul by approaching our work in what he calls the craftsman mindset, which I found so helpful in thinking about my own career in CME. So I'm really excited to get your thoughts on it too. So I'll quickly lay out the model and then we can talk about how that applies to the work that we do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So in his craftsman mindset, he says, okay, first of all, you have to pick something that's of interest to you, legitimate interest. But again, this isn't a passion we're talking about, but mild interest with a low threshold. So I think, if you're listening to this podcast, boom, you're already interested in medical writing or CME. The second step is to, within that interest, develop skills that are rare and valuable. And so what he means by that is, rare in that it's not many people are able to achieve this skill set, and it's valuable in the marketplace. And in my experience, being a skilled medical writer in CME is both very rare and highly valuable. It's genuinely hard to find people to do all the work that comes in. I know among our network of freelance writers, we're constantly passing work off to each other because we just can't do it ourselves. And people really struggle to find medical writers to do all the content work that's funded. And so it's genuinely hard to find people to do it. And this is where the craftsmanship comes in, is that it takes time to get this rare and valuable skill set. And we can talk about that craftsman thing in a bit. But the end of that is then once you achieve that level of you have these rare and valuable skills, you can then use that to leverage the rest of your career, essentially, as you can choose for yourself then the aspects, the features of your career and your work life that are important to you. Yeah.
There's so much wisdom there. I'm not quite sure where to start. I have a lot of questions, and I know that we want to talk about what craftsmanship looks like. But before we get there, the first thing that I'm thinking is this kind of message has got to be so valuable for millennials and Gen Z. So I know the millennial generation is a big generation. And my older daughter is in the kind of mid to top end of that. And one of the things that she's 27, and one of the things that she talks about a lot is this imperative to find a passion. That's the dominant message in the high school system. And so to have an argument that turns that around and says, no, you don't have to do that. There's another way to think about how to find your place of work in the world, I think will be really reassuring. So to those who are kind of in those early kind of stages of career, and for Gen Z as well, who are just beginning to think about what kind of work are they going to do in the world. And so that's the first thing. There's a lot of reassurance there, and I know we're going to unpack that a little bit more. The second thing is I love that framing of skills as rare and valuable, and maybe this is something that we come back to towards the end of our conversation. But I also think that, and maybe this is just me, but I do think it's really challenging for people who write content in this industry to see their skills as rare and valuable. And part of that is because, and I know that I've talked about this, or, we've kind of touched on this in some other podcast episodes, and I want to attribute actually what I'm going to say to you. It's a kind of full circle moment for me, is that content writing is a form of hidden labor.
Yes.
Because few people in the continuing medical education field really understand what it takes to create content and don't really understand the rare and valuable skills required to create that content. And the first time I really heard that argument about hidden labor, I think, was from you. at a meeting many, many years ago. So I don't know if you want to pick that up just now, or maybe that's something we kind of circle back around to. Maybe we get into how you get good and what that looks like.
Yeah, and then how that manifests, and what comes from that, for sure. Well, and I just wanted to reiterate on your point of the message of finding your passion. Well, what do we know about passion? It's great, but it burns bright for a while,
Right.
right? But can you sustain it even? So even if you miss the boat of not, finding a passion that naturally flows into a career, I don't know. It's fraught with complication, I think. But yeah, so craftsmanship. So what does craftsmanship look like? And when I was thinking about craftsmanship, in particular to medical writing, I thought of, so there's a classic New Yorker cartoon, and maybe some people are familiar with it, but I love it. You see two men standing at a chalkboard, presumably a student and an instructor, and you see a complex math problem on the chalkboard. And on the one side, there's the start of the equation. On the other side is the solution to the equation. And in the middle, it's written, "Then a miracle occurs." And the caption is the teacher saying, "I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. So definitely let's be explicit about how do we get good, because sometimes we don't even know for ourselves. It's sort of a miracle that happens, that unfolds slowly over time. And I can only sort of reflect on the things that I have done, and maybe that's fed into my own skills over time. So I think one thing that I have done is I've definitely embraced opportunities for training. So in our field, I think I strongly believe in continuing professional development as a thing, both for healthcare professionals, but also for myself. And so I've always sought that out. In those early days that I mentioned, where the industry split into the promotional and accredited CME sides, I thought it was important. I felt it was important kind of from a business perspective to demonstrate to my clients that I was serious, that I was serious about my commitment to CME. And so I went through the Alliance certification process. And that was one of the first waves. It actually used to not even be the Alliance back when it was the CCMEP, right, independent organization. But it's since been adopted by the Alliance, and the Alliance now carries it through. So I did that in 2008, and I've maintained that through several cycles of recertification. And so I think in doing that process, the recertification process, it recognizes both intentional training. So whether you're doing webinars or attending conferences and that kind of thing, or whether you're doing practical experience. So if you're presenting a poster, an outcomes poster somewhere, or writing for the almanac, or it just encourages that type of active learning or participation in the field. And you accumulate your points for reaccreditation. And over time, it provides another incentive that over time with the Alliance, you can be recognized as a distinguished member. So it takes a while to accumulate that many points. That'll be something I'm excited to be recognized this summer at the annual meeting, of finally becoming a distinguished member, whatever.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Whatever that means. But yes, it's a nice recognition. So I've always been thought that's been helpful, just to understand what's going on in your industry. If you are a medical writer who chooses to focus on CME, it's so important to know about your industry. But at other times, I've been more or less involved in other organizations at times when it's made sense to other projects that are going on. So whether that's AMWA, ISMAP, the International Society for Medical Publications Professionals, that's a mouthful, National Association for Healthcare Quality. So I think, that's another form of just ongoing education. The ACCME has annual meetings now. CME Palooza is a nice way to get some education that's free. That's a nice aspect there. So there's no barrier as far as membership or registration fees, which can be an issue for some independents. But even formal education, if you feel that that's needed. So for myself, I was several years into my journey as a medical writer, focusing on CME, just plugging away. But I recognized in myself that performance improvement was coming into CME, and that was an area where I had some pretty sizable knowledge and skills gaps. And I love the episode that you had with Steve Powell talking about his journey in performance improvement and the parallels between risk management and CME. Everything he was saying, I was on a walk listening to it. I was like, yes, yes. Yeah. Because everything he was saying was so right on my thinking in that. But I recognized that, hey, this is an important trend in our industry, and I don't know much about it. And for a while, I had been thinking I might want to go back to school. So a couple of years ago, I completed an MS in pharmaceutical outcomes and policy at the University of Florida. And that program focused on patient safety, medical errors, performance improvement, but those sort of system-based interventions, which has served me well in some projects. So I guess I'm a believer in ongoing education. So that's the first thing. I do have a second. So my second thing, that's about the CME side. I think on the writing side, reflecting on my own experience as a writer and some of the feedback that I get and just my own thoughts around it, I think, and especially in the context of this craftsmanship model, is that you really do have to respect your writing as a craft. We know that 10,000 hours theory of mastery, whether you're going to learn to play the violin or something, it takes a long time to develop a skill. And, it is a combination of, in medical writing, it's very much a combination of the analytical side and the research side and the science brain. But I really do feel that there is a craft side to it as well. It's sort of artistry adjacent, but not quite. But I mean, sometimes I almost feel like I am in a very creative space when I find that sweet spot of flow that Cal Newport talks about in his deep work book, of deep concentration, where it's just you and the project at hand and you're in your sweet spot of working. It does feel very creative and craft-like. And I think the last thing that I think I'll say about respecting your own writing as a craft is to be nice to your editors who you work with. Use resources like the AMA Manual Style and Dreyer's English. And I don't know why some people don't do this. And I know that they don't, because I hear a lot from editors, oh, your work is so clean. I mean, they're not saying whether it's good or whatever. They're saying, oh, it's so clean. And I think, what kind of hot mess work are you receiving? And it makes me think, just take care, just do clean, just respect your own work and bring that craftsmanship to it. And I think that would be an immediate differentiator, because I'm hearing from my clients and project editors that that's not often something that they are receiving. So when we get to that, what's rare, what's of value, submitting work that is of high quality and in that regard as well, even just something as simple as copy editing.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. The way that you describe it in terms of clean copy, I've heard, people say that they get work with half-finished sentences. So that's interesting to hear that it's more of a problem than we really want it to be.
Yeah. And it surprises me that it's a problem. And every time I hear it, I'm surprised again. But yeah.
And I love that focus on respecting your writing as a craft and the time that it takes to build that skill set and also the creativity involved. I think one of the things that's attractive about working in the education space is that there is so much scope for storytelling. It's not simply a dry presentation of, here's the data. It can be sometimes if that's what is required or called for by whomever you're working for, but it can be a really creative space. And I know we're going to get on to, how we sustain that craft over a professional life course. What are some of the ways that you find that are helpful to communicate the value of what you do to other stakeholders in the continuing medical education field?
I think that really is a major challenge. It really is. I have to say, over a career, it's taken decades to find people I work with who do value that. And even by value, we mean financially, they're willing to pay appropriately for what you bring that is and oftentimes more than just a reflection of the hours that it took you to do that project, but the years, the decades of skill behind it. But those clients and those projects, they are out there. But I agree, it's definitely a challenge. I mean, we're all aware of CME providers that are borderline content mills and want to pay freelancers the lowest possible rates. And, that's fine. That's a business model. That's okay. But I think what's really great about once you do get to that level of demonstrating that your qualities are rare, then you can work with people who also then recognize the value. Yeah, absolutely. It's a challenge for sure. Even at this stage of our careers, I know, and I know, other people with similar long, successful careers and so much work to demonstrate their skills. It's an ongoing challenge.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about how you keep this show on the road, over the course of, a professional life, because sustainability, and I know we've talked about this in other kind of arenas, but, sustainability isn't just about the knowledge work. It's also about keeping this physical body capable of tapping the keys.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, right. How do we make it sustainable? How do we make it a career that we want to stay in? And what I love about that sort of final prong of that craftsmanship mindset is that once you are good at what you do, you can then leverage that into starting to call the shots in your work life. And so that's going to be individual. It's going to be different for everybody. For me, some of the things that I am able to negotiate in my own work that are important to me is certainly autonomy. So being able to choose the types of projects that I do, and very importantly, the clients that I work with and those long-term partnerships where I do feel valued, where not only financially valued, but I feel like I'm a valued member of that team. So autonomy is very important. And then with that, and choosing the projects we like to work on, is choosing projects where we feel that our work is impactful, that it is meaningful, and however we define that for ourselves, but the feeling of doing meaningful work. And so, for example, for me, I'm very excited. I still am motivated by what the future holds in CME. So some of the areas that CME is starting to get into, like the social justice issues and racial disparities, digital health and its potential there, I think is fascinating, and it lights up the part of my brain that originally wanted to go to medical school, and it wants me to keep in the game. But I think I would only want to keep in the game if I felt those other things, like if I'm able to have the rewards of feeling autonomous, feeling like my work matters. And another is, the flip side of autonomy is also connection. I think once we are at a certain stage of our careers, we feel like we are able to contribute to the field itself. And that's rewarding. So the one way that I'm able to do that and feel that I contribute is whether it's, presenting at conferences or mentoring up and coming writers is incredibly rewarding. One of the Newportisms that really, and I keep returning to his work because it's just such a great framework for thinking about this. But, in his model, over time we grow our skills, we do the work, we put in the work, that craftsmanship work to grow our skills. And then we get to a place where we start to feel like we're good at what we do. Right. And then we start to feel like what we do is a calling because we feel those rewards. So even though we didn't enter the fields because it was our passion, we end up feeling that it's a calling. And that's more sustainable. And I really do feel that that's where I am right now in the career, 20 plus years after I started.
That's so interesting to think about the transition of craftsmanship to calling. I need to read more about that. But I love the sense of standing committed to, immersed in, and impassioned by the work
Mm-hmm.
to such an extent that there is a call to give back, to
Mm-hmm.
pay it forward. So let's talk about mentoring. Can you talk a little bit about perhaps mentoring that you've done, mentoring that you've experienced, and how that might work within this particular field?
Absolutely. So yeah, I think mentoring for most of us who work on the independent consultant model, it can be challenging to find opportunities for mentorship because that's just by definition we work by ourselves, right? I recently have had the opportunity to work on larger projects with larger teams and have been able to work side by side with more junior level people, planning conversations on the one hand, on the other side of content development, even line editing, but really talking about choices in those edits. And it's been a really, really rewarding part of this work because, and I don't know, yeah, it's unusual. It's rare that we get to do that. So, but I'm transitioning into, because I enjoyed that so much. One of the new things that I'm going to be starting this fall is I'm going to be working with the UC San Diego medical writing certificate program. And I'm going to
That's
be doing
wonderful.
yes, I'm so excited. I'm going to be doing the instructor on their CME capstone course. So what that will look like is people who are in the medical writing certificate program, they have to do a capstone project and they choose whether it's promotional or CME or a couple of other flavors of medical writing. And so for those who choose to do a CME project, I will be their mentor for that. And I'm thrilled. I'm so excited because it will be even more of an opportunity to explore the mentorship side and just giving back, really just, the pleasure of giving back. I think one thing I have heard is people being reluctant to help up and coming medical writers because they might view them as their future competitors. But I will say that is not, if that's something that you're worried about, do not worry about that. There is more than enough work to go around. Helping people is not going to in any way compromise your own job security. And for me, the process of going through and explaining to somebody else, like my choices, whether it's word choice or whether it's survey design, question prompt or whatever, it has forced me to rethink my own choices and my own writing. And it's served my own writing. And so it's had a direct benefit for me, not in addition to just paying it forward. So that's a piece, that's a layer that can be really rewarding.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that a lot of the literature on mentoring, suggests exactly that. It is a two-way relationship. It isn't simply paying it forward. There are so many rewards associated with being in that kind of relationship of exchange with someone. Something that you said very early on in our conversation when you were kind of getting into this field and you were supported by
Absolutely.
Other writers in a range of organizations who were very generous about sharing their knowledge and information with you. Do you see that as something that has changed at all over the last, 5 to 10 years? Do you get a sense of people being more protective about, their sources and the things that they use to support their work? And
that's such an interesting question. I mean, one observation that I will make is that I've seen a rise in paid training programs. So for me, there's one type of training program where I see, AMWA has a certification program, things like UC San Diego, Chicago, a couple of other universities also have medical writing certificate courses. And I sort of lump those in a more academic medical society. I sort of regard the private training as a different, and I don't know why I'm admitting I bring a judgmental, I mean, it's a business model just as good as any other, but I wonder if the emergence of those types of things has eroded the openness with which people will exchange that information and help. That said, though, I will find that yes, both more formally, so National Association of Science Writers or AMWA or those types of things, or even informally. You met half the dear personal friends in my life are medical writers who I met through work. And once you establish that network and you sort of prove yourself to be a decent person or, whatever. You just demonstrate that you're coming at it for the right reasons. People will just go out of their way to help you. I mean, as I sort of mentioned, this informal network of writers who are constantly sharing, someone offered me this project, I can't do it, can you take it on? And that type of thing, or even just, one-off help of, hey, can I run this by you? Whatever. So I feel in my life that for so long in my career that I have been surrounded by that at many points. It's interesting. I don't know now if being a newbie trying to get into it, if the barriers to entry would be higher. So that's really interesting to think about.
Yeah, I don't really know either, but it's true what you say about the rise of, these different formal kinds of training, on the academic on the one side and, a little bit more commercial on the other. And my kind of background is largely academic. So academic training, I can get my head around, that idea. But the other kind of training is, I guess one way to see it is in the professionalization of occupations. The literature there kind of suggests that one of the things that happens once professions or occupations get to a certain level is that they start to professionalize. And one of the ways that they do that is by formalizing, training opportunities. But of course, we live in America and everything can be monetized. That's the other part.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Of it as well. I'm kind of going off at too many tangents here. It just struck me. I was just curious. I think we've covered a lot of terrain, and what you've said is filled with so many good resources for people who are thinking about medical writing in the education field as a possible place to grow their talents and skills, but also for people who are more established and who are maybe hitting that period of, sometimes myself included, maybe several years left doing this work. How can I keep it fresh? You've offered a lot of information there and a lot of resources for people who might be in that place or space as well. Is there anything that we haven't kind of touched on that you would really like to emphasize about the risks or benefits of doing this kind of work?
Gosh, no, I would really say if people are interested in it, please join us. Come on in, the water's fine. And I really do believe that there is a shortage of medical writers in CME. And, we will all advance as a field together if we raise the bar on the average skill set. I think that can only really serve us all really well. And meanwhile, we'll all work together to sort of fight for better recognition of the value that we do bring. But I think that, that kind of challenge is probably true of any industry. Yeah. Keep fighting the good fight there. But it is rewarding. I think in terms of a long-term career, I think it's incredibly rewarding. And it's been so helpful for me to even go through the exercise of thinking about having this conversation today and even, digging into some of the research around it. And when I landed on that term craftsmanship, a light went off for me of how I regard my own work. And, sometimes you just need those little nudges to keep going.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing craftsmanship to our attention. Anne Jacobson on the Right Medicine podcast.
Thank you so much.
How does a person get good at what they do? What does craftsmanship look like? How do we keep things interesting and create the work and life that we want? These are all questions that have always been important to consider, but have become even more pressing in 2020 and 2021. Anne offers an elegant application of Cal Newport's Craftsman mindset to the field of continuing healthcare education. Few of us made a deliberate choice to enter this field. We found ourselves on a path that led us here. And as guests on this show consistently demonstrate, there's gratitude for the path and passion for the work they do. But most of us do not necessarily start out with that passion. Rather, as Anne observes, over time, we grow our skills. We start to feel that we're good at what we do, and we come to regard it as our passion or even a calling. We develop a craftsman mindset. And that craftsman mindset is also what makes it possible to sustain a career in this field and to become, like Anne, a long hauler. Thank you for connecting with Anne and me in this episode. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe or leave a review on your podcast listening platform. That lets us deepen our connection even further. I'm your host, Alex Howson, and this is Right Medicine. Season 2 of Right Medicine is brought to you by CME Palooza, the bestest and freest online event for the CME community. Plus, you get 2 incredibly suave gentlemen. Okay, 1 incredibly suave gentleman. I'll leave it to you to figure out who that is. The fall agenda for CME Palooza is out now. CME Palooza, where the CME community hangs out.